St. Lucia, this is Open Mic, and we are back to the third segment of our program. When we finished a while ago, I posed a question to Richard that he's just about to respond to concerning the level of the toxic assets. If they sit in a bank, who's going to man them?
And my first answer is going to be maybe our sponsor should be the one to put up the money. But no, bear in mind you've got a situation where you have one asset management corporation and you're going to try to transfer to that corporation as much of the non-performing loans as you can, and so that some of the banks will be capitalized by the money now that we'll be able to use from that. I asked the question when I went to a meeting at Central Bank with the governor and his people, who's going to put that money in? Is it the World Bank? Is it the IMF? And they said, sadly, no. They're giving all the technical expertise that we need, but they're saying, listen, you guys got yourself in this hole, you have to dig yourself out. Wow. And so the answer to that is essentially, the money will come from the sale of the security, but that will take time. So what you need is a kind of a bridging finance. And the hope is that governments themselves can come up with some kind of a bond that can be put, it doesn't have to be cash, because the banks have enough cash. The problem is no longer liquidity. Okay. But what they want to show that the bank is capitalized and it has an asset that is a good asset. So whether that's a bond or something from the national governments, not from, unlike, for example, in Europe, where the European Central Bank actually purchased a whole bunch of government bonds in order for a stimulus program to allow more money to be into the system. We don't have that freedom, unfortunately. So that's likely where it's going to come from, unless somehow we can convince real estate investment trusts or others from outside to invest in this, because they may be able to get an instrument from that asset management company that is asset backed. And so they figure, well, all right, I'll get a good return. Because right now, any international investor that can get a 3% return on his money is happy. Yeah.
And I suppose if the governments back it, then that should be okay. Now, that leads me now to many questions I have for you in the third segment of our program. I'm a little concerned, Richard, with the level of borrowings on the island at this time. The banking, for instance, at the last sitting of Parliament, the Prime Minister indicated that he's going to be, or he's been able to secure some $150 million, 11 million US from the Kuwaiti Fund, 18 million US dollars from Saudi Arabia, and $26 million from OPEC. That is for enhancements of our infrastructure. Now, I want to commend the Prime Minister for, first of all, being able to get that level of money at this time. But, there are other areas which I'm very concerned about in St. Lucia, and that is when I look, for instance, at our two hospitals, which is St. Jude's and the National Hospital. The National Hospital has been virtually finished for almost a year and a half and is just sitting there. St. Jude's is lumbering along, and our situation, our health situation is not the most ideal at this time. Does it worry you in any way? Because you probably know that better than me. I got some figures some time ago that St. Lucia pays some $150 million a year in interest. And another thing you can advise me on is I'm told that revenue-wise, after we pay our bills, we only have like 20 or 30 cents on the dollar left for us. Can you just touch on those two subjects that I just mentioned?
Okay, first of all, just on the health thing. Yes. The St. Jude's Hospital is now fully financed. Taiwanese have come up with whatever additional monies are necessary.
For which one?
To complete St. Jude's.
St. Jude. Yeah. That's only for the theatre.
No, I believe they last I heard from
they're going to make another loan.
Yeah, because I have a concern about that myself, because I want the hospital to get out of Georgia Odlum, because we have to get Georgia. So I think they're okay. It's taken a long time. It's costing a lot more than they had thought, but I believe that will be finished and financed. And the Taiwanese, I think their loans tend to be reasonably concessionary. The problem with the National Hospital is probably the counterpart funding that government had to come up with, which, and whatever arrangements to get it going. I don't really know the answer to that. Big problem with these hospitals, really and truly, once I get it up, is the cost of operations. And that is the concern.
Already 15 million is going to cost.
Well, there you go. So, we can be happy that we've got some of the best medical facilities in the region, but can we afford it? That's going to be the issue.
We have the best facility.
Well, exactly. And bear in mind, we got private hospitals, and they've had some issues as well. And you'd like to be able to think that we've got a choice. And so let's just hope that that goes right. But in respect of the loans from Kuwait and the other areas, Saudi and so on, the recent announcement about the widening of the shock to North Road and the shock bridge, I actually was able to get on the Kuwaiti website and to look at what they had to say about that loan, and quite happily, that loan is a 4% loan.
Well, he said 2.5.
Well, even better then, right? Because I thought I saw 4%, but if it's 2.5, it's even better, because our weighted average cost of debt right now is about 5.6, 5.7%. So anything we can get lower than that is going to reduce the cost of servicing the debt. And that's our problem. The 150 you mentioned, I'm not sure if that's a figure or not, but that's really the issue. The debt to GDP ratio, high as it is not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is if we had a debt to GDP of 150%, but that debt was at 2%, then the cost of servicing is not that high, and we can afford it. So, but because we've had to borrow over the last 10 years at much higher, in some cases bonds at 7.5%, it means that our cost of servicing our debt is so high, it's beginning to impact on our current expenditure and our ability to put surpluses into capital expenditure. So that's how we have to get down.
Being a business person, I always look at the profit side of an investment. And I'm saying, okay, if the PM can go out and borrow that kind of money to do the roads. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm happy to see the roads being done, but it's a question of priority. I would have preferred to see the government invest that money into something that can actually produce some kind of revenue. And I know I may sound like an old record, but I've been saying time and time again, what we need is a very top-class university like we have in Grenada. I know we could never reach Grenada, but I'm very pleased to know that some 3 months ago they did bring over quite a few directors from the St. George's University to St. Lucia. And to me, if the government were to come on board with some business people and do something like that, I would not be unhappy seeing government borrowing that money. But a road is not going to produce any money. If it was a road where you open up new lands, and as much as the Prime Minister was criticized for the Soufrière Vieux-Fort Road, I know there was a massive cost overrun, but I still think it's a good decision, because when I drive down, over the years you will see a lot of homes going up there, and that's good for the country, okay? But as he himself said, when he does that 4-lane highway up north, he's going to have to find quite a bit of money to pay for land, which is at a high price. Now, governments too can do anything, they can take credit and so forth. But getting back to what I'm trying to say is that I feel that any borrowing now should go towards investments that will produce and give sustainable jobs and continued employment. What is your take on that?
Well, you got to bear a couple of things in mind. One of them is that you can't determine exactly what people will lend you money for. Okay. And so when you go to these countries, they will say, "I'm prepared to lend you money for infrastructure. Okay. I'm not prepared to lend you money to build a stadium. I'm not prepared to lend you money to build a hotel, but I will give you money for infrastructure." And the reason why they do that is not because it's an asset that they can seize, because they know that infrastructure leads to development, good infrastructure. And so they're prepared to make those investments, as is CDB and others. So that is, if you can get the money to do those projects, it means that you are now free to go to the market where you can get other funds to do the other things that are as important. But you don't have a choice as to where you're going to, what you can use their money for. So I don't think it's necessarily a case of with the Kuwaitis saying, because let's face it, they gave us money to do the tunnel, and they're giving us money for roads. So they've clearly made up their own minds that they will only do it for development, for that kind of development. Well, but I agree with you that if, for example, we were able to find some friendly government or some other private organization on outside, because we need the foreign monies to come in, that is prepared to lend us the money, to build a nice medical complex, right? So that it can become a university like St. George's. And then turn to a good organization to come and run it. Now that would be ideal. Because I look, for example, I recently heard from SLASPA the plans for Hunora, and I thought they were excellent. Because what they're doing there is basically turning it over to a private organization who will finance it themselves. So government does not have to raise the money to pay for it. Neither does it have to make it any more onerous in terms of a charge.
But what about the revenue?
The revenue, you have to basically share that revenue with the private party, who will, because they need to get a return. But at least government doesn't have to go and borrow the money, because we just don't have that capacity any longer. So it means now, if you've got something like that out of the way, some of your other infrastructure out of the way, then you talk about the money for social projects, because we need to invest in our people. We need to have social safety nets. And where that money was coming from was Petrocarib. And that's what all of the governments in the region that took advantage of the Petrocarib arrangement, they were not restricted as to where that that loan was applied. And they were using that for social projects. And so the concern that the international people have is that with that now becoming a real problem, with the oil prices down, governments are not going to have that excess money, so to speak, to put into social projects. So now you have a competing space for both social projects, which you need to keep going on, as well as productive projects, such as, for example, a medical complex. And we don't really have the freedom to do all.
I hear what you say, and I go along with it, concerning the type of investment people like the Kuwaitis and the Saudis want to make. But I wonder if our politicians have ever sat with those people and made it very clear and explained the position to them, and say, look at me, we love what you're doing, we want to thank you for it, but this is the direction we go. And it's time we have to change course, and because this is the old-fashioned way of doing business. And I think we have to get a message across to these politicians that they have to think outside of the box and start doing projects that will, because at the end of the day, you keep offering people jobs. You have hundreds of people leaving school every year. This is a very serious problem, a very serious problem, because that will in turn affect the crime situation on the island, But I suppose there's only so much we can do.
Well, I agree with you in the sense that, clearly if we had that capacity to deal with investments in the productive sectors that generated, employment and sustainable growth, it would always be preferable. But as I said, when you're borrowing from the people like Kuwaitis, beggars can't be choosers. And I, as a good friend of mine in the sporting world, who is hopefully will become the Emir of Kuwait in a few years, and I was asking him about that, and what was the capacity for, St. Lucia to kind of come down there and get more funding, because they're a huge sovereign wealth fund. And he was saying, there's so many other countries that come that they have to parcel it out. Now, if we could tap into Norway's sovereign wealth fund, which is the biggest in the world, but even there, Norway will tell you, we must make a return on these things. We're not giving it away. It's not a grant.
But maybe it's better to go that route and everybody pays a share in it. Now, for instance, the PM said that his bond ceiling was 1.4 billion, and he's just reached that. So he's just, I think, okayed in Parliament to add another $400,000 to increase the bond ceiling. Now, when I listen to the PM and he talks of the bond, sometimes I wonder if he understands very clearly that even though he calls it a bond and he's talking of cash flow, and people putting their money in bonds, but it's still a debt.
It's still a debt.
Yeah, and what worries me tremendously is the fact that what happened in St. Kitts 2 years ago, when they could not pay the bonds, because what's going to happen when these bonds come due and you cannot pay? They told certain shareholders, well, you have to take a 50% beating on that there. Now, the island gets a bad name. Yeah. So it really frightens the hell out of me when I see that kind of money. And for instance, even I think with the Kuwaiti people, he said he's going to give them bonds. Now, when you're talking of another $150 million more in bonds again, I think the Prime Minister needs to revisit what he's doing, because it is a bit frightening. Yeah. Now, another point which I want to make is that I understand, for instance, the Prime Minister has spoken time and time again about the Black Bay lands, what he's had to do. He's had to go and buy and pay. But I think what the PM is not explaining to the nation is the fact that it's the Icelandic Bank which lent these people the money, and the Icelandic Bank went under. And he's under no obligation now to go and buy the land back. Why doesn't he just leave the land with the Icelandic Bank, and when what you call an investor comes along, let them make their deal? Why do we have to go and borrow money now to go and do that? What is your take on that?
Well, when it comes to the Icelandic Bank, the problem there was that they took money from European investors.
Correct.
And they'd used that money and they gave it away.
Correct.
Right? To fly-by-night, speculative type of developers who bought land all over the world.
Right.
In St. Lucia, there were 6 projects on the go at the same time, all doing the same thing: golf courses and condos. And it seemed that the Icelandic Bank, there was no end of money that would given to them.
Right.
Now, when that whole thing collapsed, it left Iceland as a country in a situation where it owed depositors in Europe a lot of money. And the Europeans were saying, you got to cough up, right? And the Icelandic people are the ones at the end of the day they're going to have to deal with that. So these are agreements, legal agreements that people in St. Lucia undertook, and the governments had to come in and set it. And it is not in a, if the government was to say, okay, that's tough, that's your asset, you try and sell it, and we're not going to do anything about it.
This is going to be a bit of a lengthy one. We've just come to the end of the 3rd segment of our program, and I want to come back shortly thereafter because I want to learn something about that also.